Okay, we're into chapter 7 now. And, okay, we're going to get right to the point. And we are going to start by addressing the apparent lie of Jesus, the lie of verse 8. What appears to be Jesus lying to his younger brothers when he said that he was not going to the Sukkot festival to do the outdoor camping thing along with those mobs of presumably pious people around Jerusalem. Yet we see that Jesus eventually did go, since that was the most popular festival going, and because it was one of the 3 essential festivals mandated by the Lord. And Jesus was kind of into those essentials. This was a week-long festival in which native-born Israelites were supposed to empathize with their ancestors that wandered in the wilderness for 40 long years, camping in grass-covered huts, as you can see in the picture, instead of building permanent homes in the promised land like they were supposed to do. And see, you have a picture there, and basically that says Happy Holidays. The festival took place 5 days after the holiest day of the year, which is the Day of Atonement. Fall feasting, soon after the figs, dates, grapes, and olives were harvested, allowing those farmers a full week off for an enormous Thanksgiving celebration in which they presented offerings after offerings after offerings to the Lord. So, now we see the younger brothers of Jesus trying to out him at that super popular festival. Not unlike his mama recently outing him at the wedding in Cana. But now, his bros wanting to take him out to nasty Jerusalem and seriously out him there. They were clearly not believers. Not even fledgling believers. Oh, maybe I should... we didn't bring out Billy for this, did we? Okay, we bring Billy back out. Oh, but not only Billy, we're bringing out fledgling believers. Well, I can just imagine Ella going, here. Okay. Now, some commentators, they say that Jesus never said that he was not going to the fest, but merely suggested he wasn't going there in the sense that his brothers were hoping for, not going to pull off any more of those marvels in that city that so desperately wanted to kill him, but that he would still go anyway. But that doesn't explain the subsequent chapter 9, of his healing of a man born blind. There's a marvelous thing. Or there are some that say that he insisted that he just wasn't going there openly. Geisler would say that he wasn't going to publicly out himself there. But that doesn't explain his subsequent teaching in the public at the temple courts of verse 14 rather. And there's other commentators who are more focused on the time aspect involved, a verbal aspect of sorts in which Jesus is not allegedly referring to the more immediate festival time, but rather to his more distant hour of power, his upcoming time of crucifixion. And that is a sense that would be entirely lost on his brothers, who eventually became believers despite that apparent lie. However, the above explanations would be reading a whole lot of obscure intent and content into that otherwise common reading of verse 8. Content that we do not see from a reasonable appearance of that response. So I think it would be fair to judge it as a lie, if that was the case. Not only that, but those above explanations would be reading a radically different sense of time into that verse as well, since his brothers simply wanted to ensure that he take that 3-day trip with them immediately, in order that they didn't lose him in the big city or in some silly little hut for 7 days, since they wanted to see him exposed for the fraud that they believed he was. Yes, they wanted to expose Mama's fave, either here or there, with the more public exposure being the more preferred, of course. Yeah, isn't sibling rivalry sweet? So, the response of Jesus to his brothers appears to be either false or deceptive at best. Real men are not allowed to vacillate like that. They take a stand and they stick with it. Going or not going? That was the immediate question from his brothers, like it or not. However, there's a different way of seeing this. There's a far better way of understanding the actual response of Jesus. Our primary manuscripts, which we have been addressing earlier, remember, P66, P75, and Vaticanus, are primary manuscripts. Remember P75, which I introduced with chapter 4? Fantastic. Our most significant manuscript, our earliest manuscript. It adds the word yet here. So that Jesus may be plainly understood as saying, I am not yet going up to this feast. Instead, he went a few days later. So, our other commentator, Barrett, is almost certainly wrong there. Why is he wrong? Because he did not have this manuscript at that time, back in the 50s. We are privileged to have it now. We are so privileged. Although he did have Vaticanus, so there was no excuse. What he said, this commentator, who was the foremost interpreter, someone said he was the foremost commentator of last century, he said it's probably just a slight misreading of an Aramaic original, which was supposedly the language that was common at that time, or that Jesus may have said. No. We have no evidence of any Aramaic original whatsoever. Nor do we have any later Aramaic manuscripts that are even remotely close to the quality or quantity of our Greek manuscripts. Right there. So, unlike Barrett, I am not searching for any remote Aramaic translation. Now, unfortunately, our NIV and our ESV committees will not go with that added yet. Why not? Instead, they seem bound and determined to use the current manuscript selection criteria from our embarrassing wealth of manuscripts. Hence, our version seems determined to use the most difficult reading available, even if it is a hostile reading, even if it calls Jesus a liar. So, you should take great comfort in knowing that there is no candy coating involved in their selection process. Instead, our newer versions seem to slavishly side with the current Nestle Allen translation. There's one of them. Nestle Allen translation and the UBS opinions, which are promoted through their criteria of the paradigm of difficulty. Whatever's the most difficult, we're going to use it. So, and that is something our NIV subscribes to most heavily, more heavily than any other translation. They use the paradigm of difficulty. And in much the same way, our NIV committee decided to retain woman caught in adultery account, which we will be getting into next week. They will retain that highly questionable account until something called a coherence-based method, genealogical method, is applied to our Gospels in the very near future. Yeah. Look out. This is a method which is a highly endorsed method, a computer-based model that has made a few minor changes to our epistles recently, based on different assumptions. Yes, based on the idea that we are going to defer to the earliest and best manuscripts rather than what we have the most of. Manuscripts like we introduced with Corinthians last year. So, we're going to see some changes going on with our Bible in the near future, and we'll be introducing some of those changes next year with Hebrews and Peter. So, but let's move on to belief. Yep. So, in this chapter, Calvin compares the belief of the bros to the belief of the disciples, suggesting that unlike the disciples, the bros had not yet received the Spirit, since the Spirit had not yet caused them to desire grace. Insisting that the Spirit was indeed given to disciples, despite verse 39 saying the Spirit was not yet had not yet been given, which was hyperbole and a half to say that the grace of the Spirit was not yet so bright and illustrious as it would afterwards become, according to Calvin. In other words, you must simply grant some hyperbole to John here. Yeah. Otherwise, you would have to maintain that the Spirit had never been given to John the Baptist, as well as a whole host of other prophets. And that is simply not a tenable argument. Even Tenney would not make that argument. So, let's go back to our Spirit-filled Jesus. Let's get back to Jesus being God. Here we see that even the temple guards had some sense of Jesus being God, saying, "No one ever spoke the way this man does." No doubt referring to those self-authoritative statements, "but I tell you" phrases, rather than the more common, "Thus saith the Lord" phrases. And of course, Nicky, you remember Nicodemus, had some sense of that prophetic authority of Jesus as well. And he put up a solid defense of Jesus by saying, "You cannot condemn him without a hearing," in verse 50 of this chapter, which was a Mosaic law that I mentioned earlier in John 5. Remember about having several witnesses required? Yet, for some reason, John Calvin called that defense of Nicky's a neutral defense. However, I am no firm believer in neutrality here, not in any type of neutrality. Moral neutrality, net neutrality. Anyone who claims to be neutral is simply a liar. Even judges on the Supreme Court are far from neutral. And clearly those chief priests didn't see it as terribly neutral defense of Jesus either. Nicky, good old Nicky, clearly lost his darling status among them as a result of his solid defense. His silly Gentileness was showing. Even though prophets did indeed come from Galilee, contrary to those claims of the chief priest. Finally, I'm going to address the issue of Jesus doing one miracle. It says one miracle in verse 21. Here, the sense is not that Jesus did only one miracle. No. Or that he only did one miracle in Jerusalem. No. There was clearly more than one. Have a look at verse 31 for that. Yet the sense is that Jesus did one particular miracle to offend their sense of legal decency. That miracle being healing on the Sabbath. That sense. And it was for that particular miracle that they allegedly wanted to kill him for. That they wanted to break the law of Moses for. Without a hearing. Despite their own hypocritical, which is Jesus accused them of. You are hypocrites. You are breaking your own alleged law when you circumcise boys on the Sabbath. So, Jesus called them out on their penile hypocrisy in verse 23. However, we do know the actual reason why they wanted to kill him, now don't we? We know that it was because Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. And the people of Jerusalem knew that too, as we can see in verse 25. So who's fooling who here? And of course, any time is right for the bros and the crowd to believe that messianic claim that Jesus is the Messiah. And any time is right for you quizzers to believe that as well. May you believe as well. Amen.